Tim Lawless, thank you so much for joining me. Now, house prices in Sydney and Melbourne, they're up just slightly, but around the country, down just slightly, 0.2%. Is that good news or bad news?
Well, it depends what perspective you'd like to look at it from. From the government's perspective, there has been some concern that lower house prices are eroding household wealth and leading to a slowdown in consumption. So I think in that sense, seeing the housing market stabilising is probably good news. But for those people who are looking to buy into the marketplace, particularly the very unaffordable markets like Sydney and Melbourne, then potentially higher prices in those two markets may be a little bit of bad news in what are already very unaffordable markets, despite the fact that we have been seeing values declining in both those cities quite rapidly up until June.
And also rents. A lot of people don't own a house, they rent their house or apartment. What's happening with them?
It's a very different story. Rental conditions across the country are generally benign, if not seeing rents actually drifting lower in markets like Sydney. So what that means for renters is probably some good news. If you are renting, and particularly in a very weak rental market like Sydney, then you do have a bit of negotiation ability with your landlord. Most other markets are generally seeing rents rising roughly in line with inflation, around sort of 1.5% to 2% growth year on year. And of course, from a rental affordability perspective, when we look at rental rates relative to household incomes, we really haven't seen those ratios changing very much at all over the past 10 years. Generally, renters are dedicating about 25% to 30% of their incomes towards paying the rent, whereas generally mortgage repayments are higher than that.
Going back to home owners, what sort of hit have they taken over the last couple of years overall?
Well, it's different in every city, and of course we've been seeing prices falling the most rapidly in Sydney. They're down 15% since the marketplace peaked back in July 2017, and Melbourne's seen an 11% decline in values since peaking in November 2017. Well, then you can look at somewhere like a Perth or a Darwin. Perth values are down by about 20%. Of course, that market peaked a lot earlier, back in the middle of 2014, and it's been very much an economic downturn overlaid with tighter credit conditions more recently that have really impacted on that market. And values are down about 30% in Darwin, of course, once again under a very weak economic backdrop. Whereas most other cities really haven't seen much growth or much decline, for that matter, in values at all. Generally, they've been very stable.
Is there any hope, do you think, that those losses will be recovered at some stage?
Well, I think we're probably seeing the first signs of that in Sydney and Melbourne. We aren't expecting the market to recover very quickly at all. I think it'll be quite a gradual recovery as borrowers get accustomed to the new normal, so to speak, of credit policy. Whereas in a market like Perth or Darwin, it really depends on what happens with the economy in those two regions. We're still seeing, look at WA, unemployment still well above 6%. Jobs growth is tracking at about 0.5% per annum. And we've only just seen a turnaround in migration numbers, but off a very low base and still largely negative for interstate migration rates. So even though those markets are very affordable, Perth prices are actually a little bit lower than Adelaide's now. Back in 2006, they were higher than Sydney's. So I think we do have a very affordable base to move from in Perth and Darwin, but the missing piece of the puzzle there is certainly strength in the economy, which is lacking.
Yeah, it is the overall sign in so many things that we're talking about with the economy. Unemployment's still too high, 5.2%. Credit seems people are trying to give money away to borrowers now, virtually. What does the government need to do you think, to put some energy back in these house prices?
Well, I think the RBA has been very clear, and from their perspective, monetary policy can only do so much. Cutting the cash rate further is almost a given. We're expecting the cash rate to come down probably another 50 basis points this year. But I don't think that's really going to be much of a spark for the housing market, considering lenders will probably keep a lot of that up their sleeve. What really needs to happen here, I think, is a change in fiscal policy. This is a great time for governments to be borrowing, to really be ramping up infrastructure spending. Sure, we have seen an announcement in the federal budget of a 25% lift in overall infrastructure spend, But that is over a fairly long time frame. I think we really have an immediacy here of ramping up infrastructure spending, which has a dual effect, both lifting productivity, creating jobs, improving efficiency, and also opening up some very affordable housing markets that generally have been quite undesirable because they have such long commuting times and don't have the necessary amenity that most buyers would be looking for.
And lastly, how much of the fact that the sort of free fall in home prices, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, has ended is due to the fact that we've had an election where Labor was beaten and its plans obviously were foiled to, you know, cut negative gearing and hit people harder on capital gains. Is that part of the stabilising that's occurred?
I think that's part of it. It's hard to say how much of the market stabilisation could be attributable to the stability in the federal government, but I think there has been a palpable improvement of sentiments, at least housing sentiment, post-federal election. Probably a larger component would be the most recent drop in mortgage rates and also the improvements in affordability in Sydney and Melbourne. Even though those markets are still highly unaffordable, they've certainly improved in affordability with values declining. So I think it's a mixture of all those elements and probably also some early signs of a stabilisation in credit flows as well.
Well, I think we're still a long way from being out of the woods, but thank you very much indeed for your time, Tim Lawless.
Thanks, Andrew.